You have to be pretty nimble these days not to get bombarded by news. In ever-increasing quantities, it thunders out not only from newspapers, magazines, TVs and radio sets, as you, being a World Service listener, know perfectly well, but also from computers, even from mobile phones. We're living, it's been said, in the age of the communications media. But are we any better informed than earlier generations? Do we really know what our governments or armies or the multinational businesses are up to? Journalists certainly report on their activities, but can they tell us the whole truth? And if not, why not? In a special 3-part Meridian series on the current state of journalism, we'll be exploring the new dangers involved in reporting wars and other conflicts, and the desperate struggle that's developing between serious investigative journalists and the corporations and other institutions whose affairs they try to untangle for us. But today, in the first programme, we're looking at what's widely perceived to be a problem with political reporting, the ever-increasing focus by the media on personalities rather than policies or issues, and the effect this may be having on us not only as readers or audiences, but citizens. And joining me to discuss this are Hassan Surur, a deputy editor of the Indian The Hindu newspaper, and currently its UK correspondent, who's here with me in the studio. On the line from Oxford in England, the British journalist Godfrey Hodgson, who writes, among other things, on American politics and is director of the Reuters Foundation programme at Oxford University. And on the line from Berkeley in the United States, the Dean of Berkeley's Graduate School of Journalism and himself a specialist on China, Professor Orville Schell. Orville Schell, obviously journalists know very well about the power of the personal story and the human interest angle as a way into abstract issues, and have always known about that. But I wonder to what extent you think these days that the personality has become not just a way into the story, but the story itself. I mean, maybe if you look in particular at the recent coverage of the American presidential election.
Well, I think it's quite profound, and of course it's not only the journalists who have that recognition that if they can pin a story to a person, particularly a person who's well known, that story may have greater resonance, but it's also the publishers, the owners, people who manage the bottom line of any media outlet. So that I think in my experience, many journalists would like to escape from the surly bonds of personality-driven journalism, but there's a reality that journalism is a business, and that it must be packaged in a way that maximizes the number of people who will be interested in listening to it or watching it. And it's no original insight to say that there is often a conflict between the business of journalism and the imperatives of getting information out, information that may be utterly crucial to many people's lives, but not particularly interesting to a vast audience.
Hassan Surur, how far is this over-focus on personalities a problem in India?
Well, it's beginning to happen now, since the television came in about 5 years ago. And because I think the nature of the television, because they're more interested in the drama and...
Are you talking about commercial television here?
I'm talking about the commercial television, because in India we have only the commercial television. I mean, there was a state-owned television which had a monopoly, but after about 5 years ago they allowed the private channels to come up, and now almost the entire television scene in India is privately owned. And there's a lot of competition among various channels. And a kind of dumbing down of journalism has begun with the coming in of the television. Well, I'm not blaming those television channels, but because I think it's the nature of television itself, because they're interested more in the drama.
What is it particularly about television that involves what you call this dumbing down? What is it about the nature of it?
I'll give you a very specific example. For instance, if you're covering Parliament now, if a debate is going on foreign policy or whatever, they're not interested in that. They will be interested in if an MP stands up and makes some outrageous comment or does something odd. They'll tell that MP outside, they'll talk to him, and the news bulletin in the evening will focus more on that MP, on that member of parliament, than on the debate. And with the result, what has happened is that, I don't know, I mean, it's very funny about the news desks in most newspapers, that they have much greater belief in what the television is saying than what their own correspondent is saying. So you have been through the debate for 5 hours and you come and want to do a story on that. They would say, no, but the television is saying this. So you got to go back and do the same kind of story which the television has done. So it's becoming a bit so you can see that people are not focusing on issues but on personalities, and also not really in terms of basically on what's going on the sidelines, which is not germane to parliamentary proceedings.
Godfrey Hodgson, how far would you agree that the advent of television and more television channels competing for viewers is affecting the rest of the media and the ways in which politics are covered?
Well, I think it does affect the rest of the media. Specifically, of course, it affects newspapers. And newspapers, ever since television first had an impact, which in Britain, I guess, discounting the pre-war period, was really the 1950s. From then on, newspapers have had to cope with the fact that television both can deliver news quicker than newspapers can, and also has this peculiarly vivid power to it. But I'm not one of those who thinks that dumbing down is so universal. I think one thing we've missed out, we tend to miss, is that there was a time when high international politics were really part of everybody's life. That if if you thought there was a war coming, you wanted to know, is there going to be a war? Are we going to win the war? Am I going to survive? Will my kids be killed in the war? So that from about 1914 until 1989 or 1991, fall of communism, during that whole period, international politics was really personal news that affected everybody's life. That isn't so now. People are much more interested in things like, will I have enough money to live off when I retire, or am I going to get cancer or AIDS, and if so, can they cure it? So there has been a shift of agenda for news, which is not wholly just dumbing down. It corresponds to some realities, I think.
And yet I must say, if I can jump in here, the paradox, of course, is that in many respects the world is more intertwined, interdependent with globalization, and I think one could make the case for saying that now, even more than during the Cold War, our lives rely on what happens elsewhere around the globe, and yet paradoxically we seem less interested. Foreign news gets much less coverage, and we are, in a certain sense, more bereft of the kind of sort of international intelligence that one would imagine we would need more than ever to keep this whole global operation functional.
Is there something else about foreign coverage, I'm wondering, Orville, which is that certainly in Britain, for instance, our knowledge of what's happening, the complexities of Iraqi politics, are largely represented as a character assassination of the president, of Saddam Hussein. Is there something about the way in which countries view other countries through their leaders that is a problem?
Well, I think there is a tendency to. It used to be that every country did have its signature leader, and that we have a bit of an absence, I think, these days of leaders that are compelling. Iraq is an exception in this regard. I think, in Britain you do have the BBC, which does have probably one of the largest numbers of international bureaus of any news-gathering organization. Our networks in America, television networks, have really cut down to have very, very few foreign bureaus, and the coverage shows it. There's been a dramatic decrease of international news, and when we do get it, it does tend to gravitate around stories of human interest, because news for television in America has to compete with entertainment. In many ways has become entertainment, and that means that whereas it once was a loss leader and it wasn't expected to make money, now it's expected to make money. So news departments are really scrambling in ways they didn't used to have to.
Could I come in here? I think this is happening in India as well. I think more and more Indian newspapers are cutting down on their foreign bureaus, and the kind of international news that people are interested in are basically, again, built around the celebrities, like for instance Madonna's wedding or whatever. They're not interested in serious issues.
Godfrey, do you think that one result of this is that paradoxically people are less well informed about politics than they were, say, 10 years ago?
Well, I think there's sort of elite problem here too. I mean, maybe some people were better informed 50 years ago or even 100 years ago, but most people are better informed now, I think. There is a paradox. Never have we been more interdependent, never have we been more globalized, as Orwell says. At the same time, never have we been more bored with mainstream international news. I think that is a problem. The question of personality is interesting, because what seems to me to be happening, and this is the thing that bothers me most of all, is synthetic personalities. I mean, we are supposed to be interested in media figures, in actresses. Very interesting. You don't see a profile of an actress that is critical. You don't see a profile of a politician that is other than critical. It is really quite extraordinary, that. And I think there is a sense in which news media have been captured by the entertainment business. Somebody was pointing out to me yesterday that most of the top editors in London started out in one way or another as entertainment journalists, as writing about movies or television or whatever. And now that's something completely new.
Orville, do you agree with that?
Yes, and I think, lamentably, one of Britain's greatest imports to America has been this brand of British journalism. Not that our journalism is such great stuff, but I mean, we do have the likes of Tina Brown, who I think was very much of that tradition, and it's had a profound effect. But I think one must never underestimate that behind all of this is the enthronement of the marketplace and this extraordinary worshipful attitude of entrepreneurial energy, which has certainly been very dynamic and in many ways has been very, very good for the economies of countries. But when hooked up to the media, it has had an effect that is not entirely salutary in terms of being able to explicate very complicated subjects, which in actuality most people might not really want to know about, but it's absolutely critical for at least a small group of people who have to make decisions to know about. And if that wellspring does not produce water, then we do get a kind of real ignorance at the decision-making level, which is reflected in the whole public discourse and policy-making.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. It seems to me the central problem of media is that media is a business, and at the same time it's something much more than a business. That it can't work, even for a supposedly non-profit organization like the BBC. You cannot afford to be dull, you cannot afford to ignore financial considerations, and at the same time, this is the central nervous system of modern societies, and we cannot know what's happening in our society, let alone have any ideas about what to do about it, unless we're getting accurate, quick, accurate, reliable, objective information. And at the same time, the business side of newspapers and television is increasingly reluctant to be boring, to be dull. That seems to me to be the central difficulty.
I think in newspapers, in India especially, I think more and more accountants are running the newspapers than the editors now. They are the ones who are setting the agenda for newspapers. And their theory is that well, if a fashion model is what people want to read about, then why not? There's a very major newspaper in India called the Times of India, which was a very serious paper, which has one of the most serious books pages. They have done away with book reviews because they said it's if a publisher wants to have a book review, let him pay for it, let him advertise. Why should we carry a review free?
Godfrey, we've talked a bit about the effect on us as consumers of news, in terms of us not getting access to important, if perhaps sometimes dull facts that we need. But I wonder whether you think that a focus on personality rather than policies also affects the politicians, in that now the wrong people are getting elected to high office because of this.
Well, I'm not so sure about that. Everybody said when Ronald Reagan, first ran for governor of California, he's utterly unqualified because he's an actor. Well, leaving aside whether or not he was a good president
or a good actor,
yeah. Well, the fact is that some of the characteristics of acting, the things he'd done, which included being a kind of shill for General Electric were actually highly relevant to modern politics. Modern politics may be more about putting over a speech written by somebody else, handling a radio interview, knowing how to time, how to appear, how to hold yourself, carry yourself. Sadly, in the media age, it may be these entertainment skills are very relevant.
I wonder, though, actually, how far we, the public, are taken in by them. I'm thinking of the scandal with President Clinton and Monica Lewinsky, the young intern he was supposed to have had sexual relations with and so on. And it was assumed that because Americans are famously a puritanical people, that they would sort of cry to have him taken out of office. But it seems that they could actually look beyond that to the state of the economy, which is perfectly nice, thank you, and decide he better stay. I mean, is it actually the fact that the public can see through all this entertainment that the media are throwing at them? Do you think, Hassan?
Well, yeah. I mean, I in India, basically, I don't think there's so much emphasis on. I mean, in terms of politicians, I don't think there's so much emphasis on personalities, because I don't think there are very many personalities around in India which are very television savvy or. I mean, the only one who we have is Mrs. Sonia Gandhi, but she is actually not even able to sort of speak one line without reading it out from a piece of paper. So I don't know. I don't think in India the politics so much revolves around personalities. It's more on party basis than anything in terms of party affiliations.
Don't worry, you wait. It will be.
Orville, do you think that actually the public is being done down, or they can perfectly well see through all this razzmatazz? They just enjoy it for what it is.
Well, I think there's a really cryptic dynamic at work, namely that with all the emphasis on polls, on market share, there is a huge sort of pandering movement amongst media executives, and pandering paradoxically to the people. Now, you might think from a democratic point of view this would be acceptable, that they're trying to listen to and to give the people what they want. But in reality, what's happening is you just get a lot of dirty water circulating around. They think the people want X, they give people X. Sometimes people don't want X, as you point out in the Lewinsky scandal. But what happens in this dynamic is an utter abdication of leadership. And in a certain sense, whether you're talking about politics or the media, I think it is important that there is a kind of a leadership. In other words, the media says, I think that this is important, let us present this to people, and people can make up their own minds. But instead, they're simply trying to deal out what will create the largest mass audience. And it is from that dynamic that I think this dumbing down often derives.
Godfrey, I wonder if I could look at something now just a tiny bit different, which is the occasions when celebrities, non-political celebrities, are kind of used or position themselves as figureheads to bring to the press attention something that's been ignored, let us say, like the Indian novelist Arundhati Roy campaigning around the Narmada Dam, or the late Princess Diana campaigning around landmines. Now, do you think this is a pernicious or a good use of pandering, if you like, to the media's interest in celebrity?
Well, pandering is perhaps rather a loaded word. I mean, the fact is, it is normal that famous people will be able to communicate because people have heard of them, because they're interested in them. And I think that very often these people are being used rather than being users. I'm not particularly shocked by that. What does shock me, I think, is the boring, repetitive nature of media's interest in supposedly glamorous people. I mean, there's a young woman in London, you can hardly open a newspaper without reading about her. She's called Tara Palmer Tompkinson. She's done absolutely nothing. When she opens her mouth, she says the most banal and foolish things. And yet, for some reason, she's a reasonably nice-looking young woman, like many millions of others. And yet, for some reason, the media are absolutely obsessed with this woman. And I think this kind of synthetic, interesting person is really a problem.
Can I come in here? This Arundhati Roy business actually has had exactly the opposite effect in India, because a lot of people who are in that movement, in Narmada movement, they have not liked the idea of her coming there and hijacking the whole thing. And there's a lot of resentment about this.
Yes, and it's quite interesting that, for instance, the mass movements around anti-globalization movements that we saw in Seattle and so on don't have figureheads at all. They're quite amorphous. If all three of you, if we're all agreed, basically, that up to a point, obviously, it is both legitimate and useful to use personalities and people as a way into stories, and yet that it can happen that really that's all we get. We don't get the stories. A lot of information is being lost because of the focus on it. I'd like to ask all three of you, starting with you, Hassan, if you can try and think how one could get a good balance between making news able to compete with other entertainment media, making it lively, making it able to reach a broad audience, and yet not trivialising what it's supposed to be reporting.
I think what is happening now is that the idea is to cater to the lowest common denominator. I mean, this whole new generation has come up which is not interested in anything else except gossip and entertainment. I mean, at least that's what's happening in India. The whole new generation which is just sort of interested in today, in the present, and all they want to know about.
So how do you reroute their interest so that they start being interested in things like, I don't know, taxation or civil liberties or whatever it might be?
Well, the problem is that nobody is making an attempt to reroute them. I mean, the people are pandering to that sort of thing, and the newspapers are pandering to that kind of disinterestedness and apathy about social serious issues.
So what should they be doing?
I think we're doing, I mean, the point is that that's what I said before the television came. I think we were doing that. We had a perfectly good newspapers which had a perfectly balanced kind of package. There was a package which was, we were addressing issues relating to to women, to young people, to people who are interested in books, to people who are interested in ideology and so on. But I think what now has happened is that all this balance has been broken, and we have got only one linear thing. You go on pandering to the lowest common denominator.
Orville, how does one restore the balance?
Well, I mean, I think, serious news, if one can use that somewhat sanctimonious phrase, is a bit like classical music. You don't just wake up one morning and turn Wagner on and say you love it. It takes a certain amount of cultivation and getting used to. In other words, you have to build a constituency for it. And I think the tragedy is that as major media outlets tend to have less and less, dealing with sophisticated, complex, international and domestic issues, people lose their taste for it. They lose the ability to be interested in it, to know about it, to gravitate towards it. So it's a spiral downward. I think that the old formula American television networks once had, or the news departments were not expected to make a profit. They were expected to be sort of hood ornaments of excellence. Now, that all came to an end with 60 Minutes here, when suddenly they woke up one day and they found a program in the news department was making money, and they started to say, well, why can't everything make money? So, I mean, I do think that there should be some little preserves where the market imperative is not ascendant, and where news decisions can be made on the basis of what is important.
Godfrey, very briefly, what's your solution?
Well, I think the solution is somehow to shelter the news business from the imperative to maximize revenue. Of course there should be profit, of course there should be revenue, but that should not be the main purpose of a news organization, because it does have enormous responsibilities to society as a whole.
Godfrey Hodgson from the Reuters Foundation, Orville Schell from Berkeley's Graduate School of Journalism, and Hassan Surur from the Hindu newspaper. Thank you all very much indeed.
Thank you.